Chapter 13. The Most Loyal Friend. Dawn found the three companions riding south at breakneck speed, the prince on Trudger and Tomaz and Leah doubled up on the black charger, Malial. After they had gone far and long and seen no sign of pursuit, Tomaz began to circle back to check their trail, and it became clear that they were far ahead of anyone who might be following them. When it rained again the day after, hard enough to wash away any but the most obvious tracks that they might have left, they were all confident that they were temporarily safe. To be certain, the prince reached through the Raven Talisman and confirmed that they were very much alone in the wilderness. After that, they slowed their pace, and the prince began to lose track of time. They traveled through the heavily forested lands south of Bainland and west of Formeau, moving further south toward Lake Chartaine, the largest inland body of water in the Empire of Lucia. The prince knew, vaguely, how long it would take to make the journey via the main roads, but they weren't taking the main roads, because those were sure to be patrolled by soldiers of the Empire. So, the usual number of weeks was bound to double or even triple, possibly stretching into months. The prince knew that there were small towns up and down the roads, some large enough to hold as many as 20 or 30 families. Each town that size had a garrison of defenders, the common foot soldiers of the Empire, known throughout Lucia for their zealotry, and it was the responsibility of each garrison to patrol the roads a full day's ride in all directions. And, as both the exiles and the prince were aware, there were enough towns between Bainland and Rourke that this meant, generally speaking, that there would be a patrol every few miles, and after their escape from Bainland, they had little doubt that all such garrisons would be looking for them.
"I doubt the Empress would want everyone to know that one of the children is being hunted," Tomaz said as they discussed the topic.
"Agreed," Leah said. "I think it's most likely that they are calling him a renegade blood mage. It's easy to mistake the marks on his back, and it would still be taken very seriously. What do you think?" After a long span of silence, the prince, currently walking beside Trudger, looked up over the horse's back and saw her looking at him expectantly. "Oh," he said, I think they'd see right through that." He said it so bluntly that for a moment they both stared at him, and then Tomaz threw his head back and roared with laughter. "Be quiet," Leah told him, cheeks burning. "What if someone hears you?" The big man continued to laugh, but he did quiet down. Well, as much as the huge bear of a man could quiet down. "I'm sorry," the prince said, the words still foreign to him, but persistently giving them a try. "I didn't intend to be so frank. I didn't realize you were speaking to me." "It's fine," the exile girl said, clearly trying to let the moment go. "What do you think they'll say?" The prince considered for a moment. "I think they'll keep as much of the truth as possible," he said. "I should think they will describe me as an exile. One who has impersonated a member of the Most High, perhaps. Maybe even a renegade house player who has committed treason. Such things are taken very seriously. A reward would be attached that would inspire all Most High houses to pursue me, arduously, in the hopes that I would end up being the son of an enemy house that they could—" He trailed off as he saw that Leah and Tomaz were only understanding half of the finer details he was laying out. "Anyway, likely I will be a treasonous member of a Most High house, in league with 2 exiles taking me south. Both of your descriptions will no doubt be circulated along with mine." "None of them got a good enough look at us to describe us perfectly," Leah said. "Besides, we were in those searcher robes, and—" She trailed off as the prince shook his head. "We ran into the Lord Seeker," he said. When he saw that they didn't understand, he realized that sometimes he gave them too much credit. They seemed to know so much about the inner workings of the Empire that when they didn't know something that seemed like an obvious piece of information, it took him by surprise. "Full seekers of truth are trained to have perfect recall," he explained. "They're trained to remember everything they see and hear, as their job is such that they need to be able to remember every little detail. It's not something that is widely discussed, and it's largely considered a secret, but it's why they are so good at what they do. And the Lord Seeker saw us." The prince had to give the exiles credit. They absorbed this piece of information with admirable stoicism. Anyone else who had just heard that one of the leaders of the most feared clandestine organization in the entire empire would know them on sight would probably have reacted more strongly. The exiles, however, just seemed annoyed.
"Well, that explains a lot," Tomaz rumbled. "Elder Ishmael will be interested in that."
Leah sighed and rubbed her forehead. "So he knows exactly what we look like, and you think he's, made sketches and sent them to the garrisons of defenders?" "That is probably most likely," the prince said. "Well, that's damned inconvenient." There will also very likely be a bounty attached to your heads, he continued, watching them carefully for their reactions. I agree that the specific details of my identity will be kept a secret, but I think that it will be alluded to heavily that I'm an Exile spy. That will certainly get the defenders riled up. As for the bounties, I assume mine will be significant because, as the Seeker mentioned, I'm now wanted alive. For you two, the price will be high as well.
Unless the Seeker can connect us with our former lives, Tamaz mused idly, I suppose the price would be higher then.
Yes, the prince said, unsure what else to say. Shadows and fire, Leah cursed suddenly, and the prince felt somewhat more comfortable knowing that she was showing some stronger emotion about the situation, which was indeed very serious. That means we probably won't be able to get any supplies, will we? The prince found himself utterly flabbergasted. She was worried about supplies?
We'll have to go the long way around, too, Tamaz said, looking terribly glum. Swamps. Oh, I hate swamps. Pesky little bugs all over the place. Ugh.
Don't you two understand? Both exiles looked at him in surprise. He cleared his throat and looked down, trying to contain an outburst. I apologize, he said again, the word catching once more in his throat. But don't you understand this is one of the deadliest men in the entire empire? That now he has a personal vendetta against the two of you? He will no doubt command Seeker cells from here to Rourke to actively search for you. Bounty hunters and even common defenders will have your images branded into their minds by the amount of money that is being offered for the three of us taken together. There will be no place for you to go to ground. No matter where you go, no matter what town, what city, you will be recognized and, given half the chance, killed in your sleep. This is not a matter to be taken lightly. Tamaz and Leah exchanged a look. The prince felt his ire rise. Here he was, trying to be helpful and concerned for their well-being, and all they were doing was treating him like a child, scared of a monster under his bed. But before he could speak and vent his spleen at them, Tamaz held up a hand.
Before you start, let me explain. 20 years ago, I was a member of the Guardians, a blade master.
Leah looked up, alarmed, but he forestalled her.
No, it's okay. I told him when we were camped outside Bainland.
She relaxed about half an inch, still watching the prince and Tamaz intensely, but Tamaz paid it no mind and continued speaking.
I'm nearly 8 feet tall, he said, with bluff candor. I think in these boots I might actually be a little bit more. In any case, I'm not easy to miss. There have been pictures of me in every town, village, city, and hamlet for nearly 2 decades. Hell, there's even a legend about me up in the Port of Valor. It's a good one, too. Someday we'll have to go just so you can hear it from one of the fisher folk yourself.
He grinned from ear to ear, but then he looked at Leah, who was frowning at him, and he gruffly cleared his throat and rumbled on.
The point is that all of the exiled kindred who serve as rogues or rangers have bounties on their heads and sketches made of them to put on garrison walls. This may be Leah's first, but I doubt that. She made a bit of a name for herself up north when we were in Tyne last year.
He smiled wickedly at her, and for some reason she blushed furiously. What do you mean? The prince asked.
Well, it involved a very fashionable dress and 2 or 3 young men.
Well, that is enough talk, the girl said. Let's keep moving. And with that, she jumped on the stallion's back and spurred Maliel on ahead, and, though he seemed rather annoyed to have anyone but Tamaz giving him orders, the warhorse obliged, and she was soon lost in the trees. The next few weeks passed much the same. They would talk from time to time about this or that, and the exiles would dismiss the prince's fears as irrelevant. And as time passed and they saw not a single soul, the prince fell silent and let it rest. During the journey, he began to learn small details about them, things that prior to captivity he never would have cared about, such as that Tamaz liked lavender. They passed a clump of it on the journey, and the big man let out such a bellow that both Leah and the prince turned around and unsheathed their daggers, ready for battle, only to see the big man jump off Maliel and lumber over to the purple blooms. Leah found this hilarious, and actually began to roll about on the ground with laughter. The prince began to chuckle as well, and then he was full out laughing with her, and so was Tamaz, who had taken some of the plant and stuck it behind his ears, while holding double handfuls of it to his nose and inhaling deeply. It felt good to travel with the 2 exiles, the prince had to admit to himself. True, the fare was nothing grand, mostly what Leah and Thomas caught or harvested along the way to supplement the supply of cheese and dried meat they'd restocked in Bainland. But there was a strange, peaceful quality to the woods that caught him by surprise. It was a kind of serenity that he had never encountered before. The summer was slowly fading into autumn, and as it did, the mornings became chillier, and fog would roll in at night to cover even the tallest of the tall trees, leaving them wrapped in a cocoon of misty silence. The cold was too much for the prince the first few days, as they built no fire so as to risk not even the slightest chance of pursuit. And even with the extra blanket, he could only curl into a ball and shiver through the night. But after they were sure they'd lost any pursuit, they began to make small fires, and the nights became easier to bear. The first deer Thomas saw was quickly brought down, gutted, skinned, and over a few days transformed by a mysterious process the prince could neither explain nor fully comprehend. The hide was stretched, scraped, painted with some foul-smelling stew made of various rendered animal parts, and left to dry attached to the back of Maliel's saddle, extending out past his rump like a strange sail. When it was done, Thomas presented it to the prince, and told him it was a coat, if he could make it into one. "I did the prep work since I enjoy doing it," he said, "but the rest is up to you. You can make it long, you can make it short, full sleeve, no sleeve, whatever you'd like. I've got a couple more scraps of hide in one of the pockets if you need anything. And of course I have plenty of thread. So, figure it out and make yourself a coat." "I'm looking forward to seeing how this turns out," Leah said, and they both turned to see her bringing in wood for that night's fire, a smirk on her face. "Don't listen to her," Thomas said in a quiet, conspiratorial whisper. "She's just worried your first coat will be better than hers." The prince spent the rest of the night trying to figure out how he felt about this interaction and the unexpected gift of a deer hide. For the next few days, he simply kept the hide as it was, wrapping it around him as he walked or rode trudger, like a cape or a robe. But soon he started having ideas about what he could make with it, how he could add a hood to make it a cloak, or cut a pattern to make it a shirt, and he almost broke down. He didn't know why exactly. All he knew was that something about the hide had solidified in him the realization that his life had been forever changed. Here he was, traveling through a forest with two outlaws, a hunted man, unshaven, unwashed, smelling like some dead animal, unable to return to his family, completely lost to everything and anything that had ever held meaning for him. He had no goal, no destination. He was simply moving to move, traveling with Thomas and Leah because they were the two who had rescued him. And yes, they were fine, but they weren't anyone important. They weren't people who could fix the situation he was in. They were just two people. Two exiles. How had he ever gotten himself into this situation? What was it that he had done? He needed to figure out what he had done and return to his mother, the Empress, the ruler of Lucien. He needed to return to her good favor. She was life and light and salvation to all who believed in her. If only he could find a way to show her he was sorry, show her that he was still worthy. He needed to be penitent, needed to humble himself, accept his faults, and go back. And if he died, if she needed him dead, then that was what was needed, because the good of the Empire was what concerned her. And if the Empire was better off with him dead, better off with someone more worthy wearing the raven talisman about their shoulders, better off without him, then fine. He'd give up, and let it all end that way just so that he could slap. The prince's head rang like a bell, and stars exploded across his vision as Leah struck him clean across the face. "Stop it," she said. Red, the deep, nauseating color of blood, clouded the prince's vision, and he felt rage rise up in him. It was one thing to strike him in combat, but to strike him unprovoked, that he would not let go. He launched himself at her, bearing her to the ground with him. He thought he saw a brief look of surprise cross her face, but then he didn't care, because he was pummeling every inch of her that he could reach, with fists, knees, anything at all. An enormous hand grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him backward, up into the air. "That's enough of that, I think." The prince, surprised to suddenly find himself dangling several feet off the ground, shot a murderous glare at Thomas, and then refocused on Leah, lying on the ground with a trickle of blood coming from her lower lip. "She slapped me. Shadows and light, I was just going along and then she slapped me, Thomas. By the Empress, what do you want from me? She hit me. I may not be a prince anymore, but I deserve the right to hit someone back when they hit me first." Thomas looked at Leah, who was slowly getting up. The prince saw, to mingled feelings of relief and anger, that she wasn't much hurt. He'd been so blindingly angry that all he'd really done was knock her to the ground and give her some bruises. She winced once and grabbed her side, and he felt a moment of triumph. Good! That's what she deserved.
What did you do that for, Eshendai?
The big man sounded more resigned and exasperated than curious, but he waited for the girl to respond. He was going to a dark place, she said. Had to snap him out of it. What the hell is that supposed to mean? The prince retorted. I can think whatever the burning, shadow-cursed hells I want.
A noble thought, Eshendai, Tamaz said, but did you really have to slap him? You never take the subtle approach to anything, do you?
I remember you helping me in a similar way once, Tamaz, Leah said. He was closing off. Tamaz eyed the prince, still held by the scruff of his neck in the air, and then slowly lowered him so that his feet were touching the ground again.
When I let you go, you will let her be. She struck you, you struck her. You're even. If you attempt to hurt her any more, then I can and will tie you back to the horse. In case the two of you don't remember, he shot a look at Leah as well, we're being hunted by nearly everyone in the thrice-damned empire. Likely they've recruited even their grandmothers to keep a lookout and cane us about the shins as we pass by. So, let's try to be good boys and girls who don't fight too much amongst ourselves. Yes? The prince scowled at the big man, but when Tamaz raised an eyebrow, giving his no-nonsense expression, the prince swallowed his anger and nodded. Tamaz let go of him, and the prince took a deep breath before turning to face the girl. Why did you strike me? Because you're starting to think about going back, she said, her look daring him to contradict her. You were thinking that maybe if you just went back, and even if you let them punish you, maybe kill you, at least you'd be going back and doing the right thing, the thing that was best for everyone, the thing that was best for the empire, that maybe it would even be easier because at least then you wouldn't be hunted. Right? The prince didn't respond at first. When he did, he simply asked, How did you know? Because I went through the same thing, she said. Her eyes clouded over for a moment. And the only thing that brought me out of it was Tamaz cuffing me upside the head and almost getting him killed. You hit her? The prince asked. Hit might not be the right word, Leah said dryly. As I remember it, he clocked me so hard I flew 10 feet through the air and hit a tree. A rumble chuckle came from the big man, who clearly remembered the incident. Leah pointed a finger dagger-like at the prince's chest. Use your anger. Cling to it. Let all of the other emotions burn up in it. It's the most loyal friend you'll ever have. It will always take your side, and it will never leave you helpless. Hold it close. When you feel shame or guilt, or anything at all, burn it up in the anger. Focus in on a single point, and feed the emotions, one by one, into the flame, until your mind is clear and you can think again. Anger is not useful, he protested. Anger clouds your mind. So does shame and guilt and self-pity, she said, taking a step toward him, speaking slowly and emphatically. So, use your anger to conquer those, and once you do, then you can worry about conquering the anger. The prince was skeptical. He didn't know if he believed such a thing could really help. He didn't want to fight, though, and so he didn't respond. As the silence stretched, the girl looked him up and down, seemed to decide that that was the best she could do, and walked away. The three of them began to move again, all of them on foot to save the horse's strength for when it was needed. The girl pulled further ahead, taking point, and the prince found himself walking beside Tamaz, each of them leading one of the horses. What did you do, Tamaz? The prince asked after a time, after you made it to the kindred and you knew that, for a time at least, you were safe. I drank. Heavily. The prince looked at the big man in surprise. That was quite possibly the last thing he would have expected from the man he had come to know. Tamaz saw him looking and nodded. Morning, noon, and night. The kindred knew where to find me. I made a makeshift lean-to out in the woods and spent my days drunk as a daisy. No matter how many times you say it, that doesn't make any sense, Leah called back from up ahead. Daisies don't drink. Tamaz smiled slightly but didn't engage her. It wasn't until General Goldwyn found me and told me the same thing I told Leah, the same thing she just told you, that I was able to find myself again. You can only blame yourself for so much, only take so much on your shoulders, before you start taking on the problems of the whole world. General Goldwyn and I didn't agree at first. Here Tamaz paused briefly and smiled to himself in a decidedly dark and unpleasant fashion. I remember quite distinctly trying to club him to death for telling me what to do with my life. But he stuck with it, and took time each day to come and speak with me. Me, nothing more than an ex-guardian, an exile. It didn't occur to me until later that anyone is only ever an exile by their own choice. The title is just something given to you, a name that you learn to let go of. The prince didn't know how he felt about this, and his face must have shown his thoughts, because Tomas held up his hands in mock defense. "Don't worry, I'm not trying to turn you," the big man rumbled, smiling. "You asked what helped me get through it, and I'm simply telling you." The prince nodded but said nothing. They lapsed into silence for the next few days, barely speaking more than a word to each other, each lost in their own thoughts. Every morning when the prince woke, he reached out through the talisman and felt the surrounding forest for signs of pursuit, but no matter how far he reached, he felt nothing but the muted background of forest life. One day when he opened his eyes and let go of the talisman, he found the girl watching him. For a moment, she just looked at him, and then she spoke. "Anyone following us?" The prince hesitated before responding, trying to see if she was going to mock him or in some way degrade him for using the talisman. But she looked simply curious. No, he responded. "There hasn't been anyone since we left Bainland." "I'm not surprised," she responded casually. "This is the kind of area only very dedicated hunters or foresters come to. We're lucky. In spring and early summer, this forest is downright homey. But during winter and autumn, it's miserable, either covered entirely in snow or else pouring buckets and buckets of rain down on your head. We caught it right on the cusp, and if we're lucky, we'll be around Lake Chartain before the rains really arrive." It dawned on the prince that she was trying to have a genuine conversation with him. He had heard of such things. Talking about the weather was a way the commons apparently passed the time. "Oh, yes, the weather is good. I hope it holds." A brief smile crossed her face, but she made no comment on his awkwardness, only continued the conversation. "Indeed. By the time we reach Lake Chartain, we should run into a few more people. That area is more accessible, and there are a few dirt roads that lead up to the lake itself. I know that there are a few of the more adventurous high blood who live around the lake, up in the mountains for hunting. We'll have to keep a lookout for them, though chances are we'll have to go around the east side of the lake, since there'll be no one there. Maybe a hermit or two, but no one else is crazy enough to live in that miserable stretch of bogs and swamps." The prince, realizing that this was the longest, non-threatening exchange of words he'd ever had with her, listened with rapt attention. And then something occurred to him. How was it that her teeth were so white, and her hair always looked combed and, if not washed, at least clean? "How do you do that?" he asked suddenly. "Your teeth and your hair. They look good. How do you keep them clean?" At first she seemed taken aback, but then she smiled. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it was dazzling. He wasn't sure how he felt about that, and he wasn't sure how he felt about how often lately he seemed to be unsure of his feelings around her. "Here," she said, and reached into her pack. "Take this." She tossed him a few things, and he snagged them from the air in surprise. There were two whittled things, one that had many teeth and one that had a flat bit at the end. The other items included a small pouch, half full of some sort of liquid, and a bag with some sort of white powder in it. "You're lucky I have extras. The one with the teeth is a travel comb. You know what a comb is, right?" He nodded as if such a thing were obvious, but for the life of him he couldn't remember how the groomers in the fortress had styled his hair. He'd never paid much attention to it. He supposed he'd go off on his own at some point and figure it out, or perhaps try to watch her use it and learn by imitation. The flat piece is for your teeth. You squeeze some of the cream from the pouch onto it, then shake out some of the powder. It'll feel strange at first, but you'll get used to it. And then scrape your teeth with the wood piece. There's a small pointed bit at the end that you can use to get in between your teeth. Careful not to go too hard, though, or you might start bleeding, and then I'll have to hold you down while Tomas sews you back together, and really the whole thing would be fun for no one. She smiled at him again. "Just because your back is black from the talisman doesn't mean your teeth need to be." "Right," the prince said. "At least I can do something about my teeth, though. The talisman. It's right that it's black. There's nothing good about it. It's a curse, and that's all it is." He touched the deeply etched lines on his upper chest that ran over his shoulders and to his back. They had never felt more like bonds than they did now, holding him to a life he could no longer have and making him a target for the Empire. "Nothing is inherently cursed, Princeling," Leah said.
The prince was struck again by how strangely talkative she was, and he realized that she seemed generally happier as time went by, as if this solitude suited her, and the more time she spent traveling through the forest, the more energy she seemed to absorb from the silence. "This is," he replied, trying to smile but failing halfway through. "Then choose to do something about it," she said, slightly exasperated but still trying to be reasonable. She looked out into the forest, picking her words carefully as she continued. "Look, I don't understand how the talisman works. I don't understand what it feels like to use it. But if you're convinced there's no good that it can be put to, just stop using it. Just remember this. It's something my father told me when he was teaching me how to fight. A sword isn't bad because it's pointy, and a shield isn't good because it's blunt. Both can be used for offense, and both can be used for defense. What matters is always, always the person who wields it. I know you were born into this, and you've been made a weapon of the Empire, one that they've decided is no longer of any use to them. But now you're your own weapon. You have a choice now. You have power. You have a sword unlike anything anyone else has. What matters is what you use it for." She looked back at him, and the prince found himself drawn in by her eyes, green like the sun through the forest canopy. "What matters is who you are," she said. The prince, thinking this over and trying to find a flaw in her logic, trying to see how she was deceiving him like the children and the Empress always said the Exile didn't respond, and that was the last they spoke for the rest of the day. But as he went to sleep that night, wrapped in his deerskin, warm and well-fed on the meat and roots the Exiles had gathered, next to a cunningly built fire that was both strong and somehow nearly smokeless, the prince could only admit that what she said made sense. And as he admitted this to himself, he felt guilt and shame boil to the surface of his mind. If any of the other children could see him now, here, taking the charity of the exiled and agreeing with them, this was a slippery slope. Soon he would be planning the destruction of the lives of everyone in the Empire. He'd be trying to wreak havoc on the lives of the commons who were only protected by the grace of the Empress. But then he remembered what Leah and Tomas had said about anger being his best, most loyal friend. So he reached out to it and found it waiting, like a well-trained dog. He embraced it and turned it against his mother and his siblings. His head began to fill with all of the terrible things that they had done to him. All of the injuries he had suffered at their hands, both before and after his kidnapping. And in his anger, the guilt and shame of not doing what they wanted or thought was right burned up and disappeared. And he found that he was tired, and what he wanted to do was to go to sleep. And so he did. And the next day, when he woke, he did not reach out through the talisman to feel the forest around him. He made a silent promise to himself that he would not use the raven again, though a part of him, a very small part in the back of his mind, told him that Leah had spoken sense about this as well. But for now, in his anger, he decided to forego using it altogether. Days passed, and it was as though a shadow that had lain on his heart had been lifted, and he was just a young man traveling through a forest. He began to speak more freely with the exiles, sharing memories with them. At first he was reluctant, because he thought that they might ask for important information about the Empire. And in the end, he knew they did want that. He knew that they would take any information he gave them and store it in the back of their minds for later use. And he knew too that if he finished the journey with them, that he would find their leaders and be made to talk. But for now, here, in this seemingly endless forest, he let those thoughts and worries go, and found he truly did enjoy the company of these two exiles, these two people. His brightening mood, coupled with Leah's newfound smiles, made for an infectious aura of good humor. Leah continued to needle him, teasing him about this or that, but for the first time she was doing it in good fun. And after a while he was able to score a point or two back against her, to uproarious applause from the always ready for a good bad joke, Tomas. On one of these days, when they stopped in the early afternoon while the sun still shone through the trees and birds filled the air with music, the prince pulled out his deerskin. He'd thought long and hard about it and had decided to make something simple. He stretched the hide out, smelling the deep, leathery scent that reminded him intensely of Tomas, and drew his dagger. First, he cut an oblong hole in the center. He pulled out Tomas's needle and thread and was about to try sewing the cut-out piece to the top of the hole in order to make a hood, but the big man came over and stopped him. He looked at what the prince was doing, nodded once, and said,
"Do it this way."
He demonstrated what he thought the prince should do, first making a few stitches along the inside of the cutout flap, and then using extra pieces of the deerskin to make the whole thing more flexible. Finally, the prince got the idea, took the needle and thread, and attached the hood. He picked up the garment, shook it out, and threw it over his head. It fell, long in both the front and back, almost to his knees, and about halfway down his ribs on either side. The hood he'd attached was easy to pull down or up, and, most importantly, the thing was warm and wouldn't fall off. It was simple and inglorious, and the prince loved it. A drape over? He turned and saw Leah watching him. The prince felt Tomas's hand encompass his shoulder.
"Certainly is," said the big man.
The girl eyed it critically, and then nodded. The prince felt a soaring feeling in the pit of his stomach. "Looks good, actually. I think the proportions would be wrong for anything else. How's it feel?" "Warm," the prince responded simply. Tomas chuckled.
"Well, that's the most important thing," he said, and then he turned away to start prepping the evening fire.
Their journey continued, and as it did, there were a few nights when, restless, the prince and Tomas would spar. The first night, Tomas thought he was joking.
"Princeling, I'm sorry, but I could break you in two with a hard sneeze."
"All right," the prince said, adding a biting, taunting twist to the words that he had learned from Leah. She laughed as he said it. "Then do it."
"Fine," the ex-blade master said as he rose to his feet. "But no blades. We can use staves if you want to find some likely-looking branches."
After some searching, they found some, and, as predicted, the prince was soundly beaten several times in a row. "Again," he said, after being knocked down by the big man's staff. He could already feel bruises forming on his arms and legs from where the wood had struck him, but he was ready for more. It felt good to be active. The cuts on his wrists and the wounds he'd received from the Death Watchman had all healed, and he felt whole. He had been too long away from the practice yard anyway, and he knew that he was in desperate need of exercise. Obligingly, the big man readied himself again. Most every night from then on out found them at it again, and though the prince struck the big man a number of times, he never landed a serious blow. Tomas, though big as a small hill, was faster than the prince would have predicted, and never tired. It seemed as though he could move forever. He reminded the prince of his brother Ramael and his sister Daisuna. Ramael, the prince of oxen, had a similar build and, bearing the ox talisman, could perform feats of strength that were impossible for a common man. Daisuna, the prince of wolves, never tired. In fact, she never rode a horse because she could run the length of the empire without stopping for food or rest. Leah, on the other hand, refused to spar. "Why not?" the prince asked, trying to remember the way she had taunted him about something else a few days earlier. "Are you poultry?" "Chicken," she corrected him. "Am I chicken?" "Yeah," he said. "Well, are you?" "Sure, princeling," she said. "You tell yourself whatever you need to keep your manhood intact." And throughout it all, the prince held on to his anger. And, slowly, as the girl had predicted, it began to eat away and dissolve his doubts and guilt and shame. Hope grew in him that he might be able to free himself from the empire entirely. They made camp a day outside Lake Chartaine, and he fell asleep fully at peace for the first time that he could remember. When he woke, it was to find a defender of the realm holding a sword to his throat, silhouetted against the rising sun.